And you write that from 1919 to the present day, Afghanistan has struggled between reform and reaction, the latter used effectively by imperial powers to undermine the sovereignty of the country. Can you start off by maybe discussing the history of Western intervention in Afghanistan and how you believe it changed the country's trajectory?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that between the 1920s and the 1990s, Afghanistan had not one, not two, not three, but four constitutions. Now, a constitution is a good place to start when you look at a country's dynamic, its trajectory, and so on. The first major modern constitution, Rania, was in 1923. And in that constitution, in 1923, the people, mostly the liberal aristocracy and others, committed Afghanistan to a policy of equality between men and women, education, healthcare reform, and so on. Now, obviously, the constitution was delivered by a king, King Amanullah. Yes, certainly when they said equality, they had other ideas in mind. But nonetheless, there was a formal commitment to equality. That was reinforced in 1964, a very important constitution that actually opened the door for elections. And in 1965, there was, elections in the country. 4 women were elected to parliament, including a communist. There was another constitution in 1976. These constitutions, 23, 64, 76, these were not pushed forward by the left. These were pushed forward by liberals, aristocrats, and the left, working together. And they really wanted to provide Afghanistan with a future. Again, the core questions, the 3 core questions for any modern government: eradicate hunger, get rid of illiteracy, and make sure you can contain sickness, create some sort of healthcare infrastructure. Around that, you've got to build the infrastructure of the country, build the roads, build the schools, of course, build some industry, agriculture, dignity for people. I mean, the whole package, it was there. In 1973, there was essentially a liberal coup when Muhammad Dawood overthrew the king, King Zahir Shah, and took control. Now, very interesting. The communists come to power in April of 1978. We're talking about 1973 when the liberals took power. When Muhammad Dawood took power, he turned his eyes at the university, because at Kabul University, there was a core group of people who were the leadership of the Jamaat-e-Islami. This is a political organization, inspired to a large extent by Saudi Arabia, backed by sections of Deobandi mullahs from Pakistan and so on. They were led by a man by the name of Burhanuddin Rabbani. Now, it's really quite fascinating. And because this story goes back to the early 1970s, it should give people a sense of what the contest was about. It was not actually initially between communism and imperialism. It was between liberalism, Afghan liberalism, and the imperialist powers. So, here's Muhammad Dawood, comes in, he's the head of the government. He targets the Islamists and says, look, guys, you can't be going around saying women can't have education. Rabbani's number 2 was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's still around in Kabul today, a nasty piece of work. His other fellow was Ahmad Shah Massoud, who people began to see as a great hero, but was a nasty piece of work. These fellows fled across the border to Pakistan, and they took up residence in Peshawar, in Baluchistan, in sections of Waziristan, and so on. They fled Afghanistan not after the communist coup, but after the liberals came to power. In Pakistan, they found no friends, because at the time in Pakistan, there was a relatively socialist government led by Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So from the early 70s, they tried to do some things in Afghanistan, but they couldn't really move an agenda. The Saudis had a massive influx of oil revenue after the 1973 oil shock. So the Saudis started to fund schools and started to fund a lot of the kind of institutional apparatus for what would become the Mujahideen, led by people like Burhanuddin Rabbani and so on. After the overthrow of Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and his assassination, by the very right-wing military dictator Zia-ul Haq, a military coup backed by the US government in 1977. After Zia came in, they put a lot of resources into Rabbani and this gang of thugs. And then this gang of thugs started to go and start building their operations inside Afghanistan. Again, Rania, this is before the communists take power in April 1978. When the communists take power in April 1978, they try to deepen the reform agenda. One of the things they do is they send tens of thousands of young people in a mass literacy campaign, because they realize, when literacy levels are at 4 or 5%, it's obscene. You've got to lift that. Tens of thousands of young people went around the countryside to lead a literacy campaign. That was one of the first mass campaigns of the communists. And what did the Pakistanis, the CIA, the Saudis, what did they do with this so-called Mujahideen? These Mujahideen gangsters crossed the border and started killing these literacy workers. That was the beginning of their so-called freedom movement in Afghanistan. That was entirely backed by Washington, D.C. And I want to underline this so there's no confusion. Washington, D.C. joined forces with the Saudi royal family, with the military dictator in Pakistan, not to undermine the Afghan communists, but to first undermine Afghan liberalism. Even liberalism was intolerable to them.
Why? Why the opposition to even liberalism? Why was literacy promotion such a threat?
This is an excellent question. And this should be the question that a journalist stands up and asks Joe Biden or asks Barack Obama or Donald Trump, or go all the way back, actually go all the way back to Richard Nixon and to Jimmy Carter, who Jimmy Carter's government is the one that really started to finance the Mujahideen. They need to answer this question, so do the royals in Saudi Arabia. But since they're not on your program, let me give it a try.
Yes,
I'm going to try to analyze it on their behalf.
Thank you, Vijay.
It's pretty clear, Rania, why the landlords, the landlords in most of Afghanistan, combination with the mullahs, but not all the religious figures, but a large section of mullahs and landlords and so on, and sections of the aristocracy certainly didn't want any democratization in Afghanistan. That was a threat to their authority. Land reform would have been an abomination for the royal families and for the landlords. So you can understand why the elites in Afghanistan were not interested. You see, Muhammad Dawood, the liberal head of government before the communists, he wanted to drive this agenda because he wanted to modernize his country. He wanted to have industry. He wanted to have better infrastructure. He wanted to live in a modern country. That's what motivated him. What motivated the communists was the mere sense that everybody should have education, healthcare, people should not be hungry and so on, and that there should be a system where people are rewarded for their labor. Either way, they had an agenda, and you can see why the landlords and the mullahs opposed this. That's one thing. You can understand why the United States opposed this, and so too, therefore, their Saudi and Pakistani allies. There's two reasons why this group of people opposed the agenda of liberalism and the left in Afghanistan. Two reasons. The first reason is, of course, bordering Afghanistan just north of the Amu Darya was the USSR, the Soviet Union. And there was a great fear that the Soviet Union had made Afghanistan a client state. Now, it should be said that after the revolution in the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet government went to Brest-Litovsk, signed a deal with the Axis power, saying we're leaving World War I, what would be called later World War I. In that Brest-Litovsk agreement, the Soviets insisted that Persia, today's Iran, and Afghanistan must be independent sovereign states. As a consequence of that demand that the Soviets made, Lenin, who was the head of government in the USSR, opened a correspondence with King Amanullah of Afghanistan. They wrote to each other, and the Soviets said, look, we want you to be an independent state. We have no interest in overrunning Afghanistan. We have problems in Central Asia. We don't want to enter Afghanistan, but we want you to be an independent state. This Amanullah greatly appreciated. And what one sees after that is a lot of Soviet assistance inside Afghanistan from the 1920s, in fact, right to the 1990s, and even later. This Soviet assistance, Rania, included in 1950s, all the roads in Kabul were paved by Soviet engineers. Soviet equipment crossed the Amu Darya. That was an intervention. They crossed the Amu Darya, they came to Kabul, and they paved all the roads. I mean, I remember talking to people about this, old timers in Kabul who remembered the Soviet equipment in the city, building their roads. That was in the 1950s. That was at a time when it was a monarchy. There was a very close relationship with the USSR and Afghanistan, but it was not a client state by any imagination. The United States, by the 1970s, particularly when there was this stirring movement in Iran, and certainly after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the attempted revolution in Pakistan that same year, very much an upsurge from below. When these things happened, the Saudis were scared, and so was the United States, that the Soviets were somehow going to come into Iran, come into Afghanistan and then Iran, and threaten Saudi Arabia, and they wanted to block it. So at any cost, they were at any cost going to undermine both the liberal government in Afghanistan that had close ties with the USSR, and then certainly the communist government. So I think that's really what was motivating these outside forces. Pakistan, it should be said, was really operating at two levels. One, it operated as on the behest or doing the work of the United States government. But secondly, you see, Pakistan and Afghanistan have a long-standing problem. In 1893, the British drew a line through that northern region of what was then British India. It was called the Durand Line. The Durand Line went right through the homeland of the Pashto-speaking people, or the Pathans. There's a very large section of Pathans live in Pakistan, and some live in Afghanistan. Till today, the Afghans and the Pakistanis have not agreed on that border. And this demand for Pakhtunistan, or the land of the Pashtuns, remains a living sense in that region. So Pakistan has always played a game in Afghanistan to prevent a strong government in Kabul that would then try to fix the borders. Now, that's a small motivation for Pakistan. It's not actually a big motivation. The real thing was that Pakistan put itself at the service of the United States and was, lavishly rewarded for a time by Saudi Arabia.
There was a leftist movement in Afghanistan that had power for a little bit of time. So can you talk about Afghanistan socialist movement? How did it come to be?
Because of this correspondence between Lenin and Amanullah, King Amanullah, the Soviets and the Communist International didn't actually drive a hard agenda to create a communist party in Afghanistan. The Indian Communist Party was founded in Tashkent, just across the border from Afghanistan in the USSR, and Indian communists were sitting in Kabul. They had gone up, from Peshawar, in fact, and across the Khyber into Kabul, and that's where they regrouped, and Indian communists came back to India from there. It's a separate issue. The point is there was no Afghan Communist Party. The Afghan Communist Party is first founded in 1964, after the Constitution of 1964. Just imagine that. It borders the USSR, and there was no left party. There was a Communist Party in Iran, even though the Iranians had been told essentially that it should be a sovereign state nonetheless. But in Afghanistan, there was not because the Afghans were not capable of it. There's a lot of really racist talk about Afghanistan as this barbaric, backward place. No understanding of, how remarkable and incredible is its history. The brief bits I'm telling you, it's quite remarkable, the history of Afghanistan. There is this old racist idea that comes from British ideas of the Afghan as a kind of noble savage. It's nothing further from the truth, in that. Anyway, the point is that when the Communist Party is created in 1964, there are various factions, as in any party. The faction that was not dominant, but was really quite, moving an agenda, was a faction that was led partly by a friend of mine, Anahita Ratebzad, who was one of the first 4 women to enter parliament in 1965. They were the faction that believed in a united front policy, building power with the liberal factions and so on, driving a broad Afghan patriotic or national development agenda. Then there was a couple of ultra-left factions. One group became a Maoist group and actually later would turn against the left-wing government in Kabul. They were kind of a very nutty Maoist group and small section and so on. But there was a section of the communist movement that was very sectarian, led by an extraordinarily good writer, Hafizullah Amin. He had made his living as a short story writer, wrote with great feeling about the suffering of people and so on. And Tariqi and Hafizullah Amin were the two. Tariqi, the great writer, sorry. And so you had a situation where inside Afghanistan, inside the left, there was great dispute and disagreement. This disagreement came to a head after 1978. After the coup, after the takeover. You see, that coup was facilitated by a very simple fact. Remember, I'd said that the Afghans got a lot of assistance from the USSR. Most of Afghanistan's army was trained in the USSR. And, the Marxists basically dominated the army. So when the coup took place in April of 1978, the army played a major role there. But they immediately handed over power to the civilian political party, and that's when they created essentially a democratic republic in Afghanistan. It was a civilian government. But inside the left, there was this dispute. There was often an accusation that one of the main left leaders was a CIA agent and so on. There were gunfights inside the presidential buildings. And, there was a lot of factionalism for sure. But by 79, 80 or thereabouts, some of the factionalism had eased up. When Babak Kamal comes to power, he frees people from prison. They open an agenda up, but it's too late actually, Rania. By the time Kamal comes to power, Anahita, is a major figure in the government. It's too late because what has happened is as a consequence of the massive backing by the US, Saudis, Pakistanis, and others, the Mujahideen had started to disrupt the countryside, come in and start a massive killing spree. That was happening on one side. Secondly, the government of Amin and Tariqi, ultra-left government, had really cracked down against their own comrades, throwing them in prison and so on, demoralized people. Combination of these two things, when Kamal comes to power and tries to settle everything, tries to ease everything up, they feel that they are under great threat. And they ask the Soviets to intervene. Now, this is an interesting thing that's often not remarked upon. The Soviet Politburo debated intervening for months. And now we have all the Politburo notes. These were released, after the Soviet Union fell. And you can listen to the voices of the Politburo members saying, we don't want to enter. Wow. But they feared two things. They feared a repeat of two events. They feared what happened in Chile in 1973. That was fresh on their minds. The overthrow of the government of Salvador Allende, the coup by Augusto Pinochet, the mass slaughter of the left, and so on. That was fresh on their minds. Then they talked about it. Also fresh on their minds was the massacre of communists in Indonesia in 1965. These two things were in the air. And so they reluctantly crossed the Amu Darya into Afghanistan. And what's interesting is, I was not there at that time, but what old journalists and others, say, not the Western journalists, but journalists who were in Kabul and so on, what they say is, in fact, the Soviets didn't much go into the front line to fight the Mujahideen. They mainly stayed doing a lot of training work and so on. They were not that much present in the front line, although they were. It's not that they were not, but they were not like enormous. They were not doing the bulk of the fighting. That was done by that Afghan army. And I got to say that after the Soviets withdrew, by 88, 89, after the Soviets withdrew, remember the communist government actually stays in power till 1996. That's when Muhammad Najibullah, the last left-wing president, is assassinated by the Taliban. He and his brother were strung up and killed by the Taliban in 1996. They were pulled out of a UN compound. But for the period of 6.5 years, the communists stayed effectively, not in power, because it was a civil war, it was chaos. But the army didn't collapse, unlike this Ashraf Ghani's army, which collapsed in 11 days. There was no collapse. So the point I want to make is the communists were in power. They drove a very good agenda of reform, education reform, healthcare reform, trying to increase food production. The question of women's rights was front and center. In fact, when I met Anahita later, she was quite clear that, hey, listen, she told me every edict that I pushed, right of women to divorce freely, right of women to inheritance, and so on. Everything she said I pushed was there essentially in the 1976 Constitution and in the 1977 civil law. She said, we were just enacting the bourgeois law. It's not like we were pushing. The bourgeois law said women and men are equal, and equal as well in inheritance. So nobody applied it. We were going to apply it, for God's sake. And then they were said they are evil. They are out of touch with their country. Out of touch with the country. It's the Constitution, for God's sake. How are they out of touch? They were definitely out of touch with the landlords and definitely out of touch with the reactionary mullahs. That's true. But out of touch with the country, how? They enacted the Constitution of 1976, for God's sake. This is a point that I don't hear getting made at all, because people have this assumption that out of touch communists come to power in Kabul and then they start pushing a hard left agenda which alienates them from the people. Nothing is further than that from the truth.
Was there an understanding of what the U.S. was backing, of what this Mujahideen actually was, that they weren't quite freedom fighters? Or was it similar to Syria now, or the last 10 years, where there's all this international propaganda to the point where you've got Al-Qaeda in Syria being propped up as freedom fighters?
Philip Klonsky was in Kabul, spent a long time there reporting for the People's Weekly World, which was the newspaper of the Communist Party in the United States. And Klonsky was, offering the story from Kabul, saying, look, this is the government, this is their agenda. Today I interviewed somebody who is the Minister of Agriculture. They're conducting land reforms. Next day, Klonsky's reporting was superb. He was talking to the people in the government. He was talking to ordinary Afghans. He was writing it as he saw it. I think his work was excellent in that period. So I wouldn't, throw a blanket over it. I think in the international left at the time, there was some confusion when the Soviets entered. Because this was not the first Soviet intervention that became an international issue. The first was in 1956 when the Soviets entered Hungary. The second was when Soviet tanks entered Czechoslovakia. There was an intervention in Poland. But these three were the big international, scandals, as it were. 56 Hungary, which there was a break in the left, in particularly in the West. The creation of the new left emerges after that. Edward Thompson and all of them leave the British Communist Party after 56. 68 was, seen as a horrible intervention because it was to put down the government of Mr. Dubček, who said, I want socialism with a human face, and so on. So given the history of Hungary and Czechoslovakia and whatever differences of opinion people had about those two interventions, this intervention was seen in that lens, which I think, given the fact that the Soviets didn't publicly say, we are really in two minds about this, what we learned later was that the Afghan intervention was nothing like the intervention in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia. This was of a different character. Here, the Soviets actually feared that there would be a bloodbath. This was actually a little bit, and I don't want to overdo the comparison, this was a little bit like the Vietnamese military that entered Cambodia to stop the killing fields. When the Vietnamese entered Cambodia to stop the killing field, the whole point of that intervention was that there was a genocide going on, and Vietnam came in. I don't know anybody who criticizes that intervention, Rania. That was an act of extreme heroism by the Vietnamese people. It was the United States that actually backed Pol Pot. It's an issue that people may be confused about. Pol Pot was, yes, a man of the left, but he was backed by the US government. He had lost his head. What they did in Cambodia was a horrendous genocide. And the Vietnamese put a stop to it by intervening. And I think, in a way, the Soviets were not able to make the case for what they were doing, and therefore, appeared like just another imperial force entering, and therefore, just as the British lost twice and the Soviets
Yeah.
lost once, and this very tired and erroneous phrase that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires gets recirculated, because in fact, there's a big difference between British imperial interventions in the 19th century and early 20th century. There were three wars the British fought, the 1842, 1878, 1880, and then 1919. And they got defeated in 1919, by the way. They fought three wars. The Soviet entry was not like the British entry. It came in there to support this government and to support the left. I think it was, in retrospect, I think we should say it was a miscalculation. That Andropov and others had been right earlier to caution we shouldn't enter Afghanistan. It was a miscalculation. I don't think they should have entered. I think there were other ways to go. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight and so on. But I should also say, it's not just hindsight. As I had said earlier, the members of the Politburo and the Standing Committee made arguments at the time, don't intervene. In fact, the KGB also made arguments, don't intervene. So I don't think it's merely hindsight. I think we have to look back and see that record. And also, I think, be very honest, Rania, that it was perhaps not the best thing for the region at all, for the Soviet troops to cross the Amu Darya in such large numbers. Let's just be clear. The 9/11 attack took place because US troops entered Saudi Arabia in 1990-91 to eject Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait. The attack on the United States had nothing to do with Afghanistan. It was Osama bin Laden's anger that there was United States troops in the great land of his ancestors. And he was very upset by that. He went and argued with the royal family and said that these soldiers should leave. He fell out with the royal family, fled to Sudan. Then eventually he comes back to Afghanistan, where he had been fighting alongside the CIA against the Soviets. So actually,
the drama is crazy.
But it had nothing to do with Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan wasn't the cause for the creation of Al Qaeda. It was just where Al Qaeda took refuge.
Well, it certainly was like in the chain of events, right? Like it's like where these people met, these Afghan Arabs, they met in Afghanistan fighting alongside the CIA. And again, it's just speculation. Like maybe 9/11 still would have happened, but there's a chance it might have not, had the US not created a place for these people to organize, get to know each other, and then, become friends and move on from there.
But the interesting thing, Rania, is that you didn't need Afghanistan, because after all, the Saudis from 1964 onwards in the World Muslim League had been organizing this section of the very far right-wing Islamists, from 1964. And it's interesting, where they put their eggs is where the omelets were made.
That's a good point.
They put their eggs in Chechnya and Dagestan, and you saw a massive war in Chechnya and Dagestan. They put their eggs later, for sure, in northern Syria. I mean, look, the Syrian government allowed these Saudi preachers to come and set up their mosques in Aleppo, in Idlib, all across northern Syria, actually. And when there was the drought and there was that massive displacement of northern Syrian peoples into Aleppo, particularly Aleppo, but also into sections of the area around Damascus, including south as Dara and so on. These fellows took refuge in these Saudi mosques. They got fellowship from Saudi money. That was the relief money and so on. That sets up the terms for the uprising. So actually, you didn't need Afghanistan. You did this in the deserts in Libya. They did go to Afghanistan and train. In the jihad, they all fought and so on. But that could have been anywhere in the world. That's what I'm saying.
That's a good point.
It wasn't like something out of Afghanistan, that Afghanistan drew them and so on. It's not Afghanistan's fault, is what I'm trying to say.
No, of course.
I'm trying to say, don't blame Afghanistan, guys. It's just a beautiful place where it's awash with wealth. The Afghan government of Hamid Karzai said they are sitting on $3 trillion of gold, of precious metals, including lapis lazuli and so on. It's an extremely rich country which has been impoverished, and the people are delightful people. of different ethnicities, very diverse place. And it has an Islam that is so rich and complicated. It's not the Saudi kind of Islam. So what I'm just trying to go round and round to say is that, of course, it's true that the Al-Qaeda roots itself in Afghanistan. Of course, all that's true. But it could have rooted itself elsewhere. Now, the very fact that it did root itself in Afghanistan has a lot to do, as you said, with the game that the CIA played, not from 1979. It actually, Brzezinski's late. That's the point, I think. This all begins in 1973. During the Nixon administration, some of these games begin. Despite the fact that the government of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was not keen, the CIA was already there. And I know this because I interviewed Chuck Cogan, who was he was in charge of operations, directorate of operations for that whole region, basically from Lebanon out to Afghanistan. But he was based in Tehran. Chuck told me repeatedly that, their dirty tricks began long before Brzezinski and Carter and so on. And I think that's why I insisted on the point, Rania, about the liberal government being undermined in Afghanistan. It's not like the CIA was sitting next to Mohammad Dawood saying, how should we take care of the communists? They were sitting across the border with Burhanuddin Rabbani and saying, how do we overthrow the liberals? That's crazy, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the same, I guess you could also say it's like the same kind of thing the US did in Egypt in the 50s, right? Backing the Muslim Brotherhood against Nasser and the sort of like Arab nationalism. So you're right. It's not like Brzezinski thought of this first, right? Of using religion against communism or against liberalism even, or any sort of nationalism that wants to project some sort of sovereignty and protect it. But I guess, from there, I would want to ask you, and this is more locally about Afghanistan, just the way it gets talked about, the way the countryside in particular, there's this obsession in Western media of presenting this binary of Afghanistan, of urban versus countryside, right? And the urban areas are where women want rights and are more educated, and the countryside just wants to stay in the Stone Age. This is a constant theme I see from, the New York Times to the New Yorker to there's so many New York based publications, but maybe that's the problem. But I guess my question for you is, was this inevitable that Afghanistan would end up in the hands of the Taliban like this? Obviously it's not incorrect to say there are some very regressive forces in Afghan society, as there are in many societies, but were they destined to win? Could they have won so much power across Afghanistan without the backing of imperialists going back to the early 1900s? And I specifically remember an anecdote that you use in your piece from the late 1920s, I think it is, where the Queen of Afghanistan is on a trip to France, and she meets and you can correct this if I get any of it wrong, but she meets like the French leader at the time, unveiled, and the British take photographs of this meeting, and then they push it out through Afghanistan, particularly to provoke and anger the conservatives. So this is just an ongoing theme. So I guess, was it inevitable that Afghanistan would end up in the hands of regressive forces? And I kind of know the answer to that, but I would like you to kind of respond to that constant narrative that we see.
Well, in human history, nothing is inevitable. I mean, even the onward march to socialism is not inevitable. I mean, we can see the barbarities that have inflicted the planet now. Rosa Luxemburg's great line, socialism or barbarism. Well, you can go either way, guys. There's no inevitability. You have to fight to make the world better. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, that Afghanistan was posed with a whole set of choices, and the Afghan people were in a long struggle. In 1973, when Rabbani goes across the border, he might have become a footnote in history. Look, Rania, you're in Lebanon, for instance. We have seen in the Middle East, or rather in West Asia, so many forces that have become footnotes in history. They just didn't succeed, and their projects failed, but they linger. They are still around, and I don't want to name any of them because in Lebanon nobody likes to feel like they are a footnote. But there are many forces that I know, and I've interviewed people in and around Beirut that they're never going to be able to have an effective political project in the region any longer, but they still exist and so on. Rabani would have been that footnote. He would have been gone to teaching maybe in the University of Peshawar. He taught Islamic theology. Hekmatyar would have become a heroin, smuggler, which basically he was. Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was, a sanctimonious Islamist, would have gone around, being a preacher maybe, of some kind. All of this could have happened, and then a opening could have taken place. Afghanistan could have gone in a direction, and this is what's interesting. The reform agenda in Afghanistan, when it opens in the 1910s, is not entirely, it's not motivated by Britain or the United States or something. It was inspired by the fact that Mahmud Beg Tarzi returns to Afghanistan, his home, from exile in the Ottoman Empire. While Tarzi was in the Ottoman Empire, he imbibed all the energy of the Tanzimat reforms. He learned about what was happening inside Anatolia, but also Syria. I mean, his wife, Asma, was born in Damascus in 1877. So they brought that whole history into Afghanistan, and their daughter marries King Amanullah and becomes Queen Suraya. I mean, these were powerful people, but they carried the whole Ottoman reform agenda, which in the Ottoman Empire provokes the Young Turks, and then you get, Kemal Ataturk and so on. Afghanistan could have had that history. It's plausible that that somebody could have become like Ataturk. In fact, I've often suspected that Mahmoud Dawood, who becomes this liberal aristocrat, he imagined himself as a kind of Ataturk, an Ataturk who wore suits. I've often felt that they were rooted in that world. They were not looking to New York and London and so on, or even Moscow. They had their own reform agenda. Now, Rabani would have been a languishing professor at the University of Peshawar. Muhammad Dawood, and maybe in association with the communists, could have created a new agenda. Afghanistan would have been in a different place today, and could very well have been. Look, you travel in Badakhshan and these provinces in the northern part of Afghanistan, and you see young men and women working in the mines, mining for lapis lazuli and so on. You see them working outside Faizabad. I mean, these are hardworking people. If they were in a movement where the miners created a miners' union, where they democratized their thinking through the struggle, for justice as miners, if in the countryside in Helmand province there was a movement for land reform, I mean, you would have a very different Afghanistan today. Rather than put the hand quickly to the gun to shoot somebody, they would have put their thinking caps on and gone on a march and tried to liberate their country. And that possibility was very much there in the 1970s. I find every once in a while on social media, people post pictures of women in miniskirts in the universities as a symbol of modernity. I find that a little offensive, actually, because it doesn't actually, it's correct that Afghanistan in the 70s was on the edge of a new period. But that's not the image that I think of. I think of those literacy workers sitting in the countryside, sitting on the ground, surrounded by men and women, teaching them how to read and write. That's the actual photograph, Rania. That's the actual photograph of the possibilities of Afghanistan.
And I wanted to ask you just like a couple more questions before we wrap here. Moving to the U.S. withdrawal, I know we've mostly been talking about the sort of buried history that we don't get to hear so much about, but shifting to the recent U.S. withdrawal, I'm curious your thoughts on, and again, I'm asking you because I can't ask Joe Biden, but I'm curious your thoughts on, why do you believe that the U.S. withdrew now? And now they're actually responding in, I think, a very cruel way, which is after spending the last 20 years really building nothing and then just like leaving and kind of pouring gasoline on the country on their way out, the U.S. is now sanctioning the Taliban, which is the sitting government in Afghanistan, and causing basically an economic collapse across the country. Now all the aid money has, fled the country. They've frozen their central bank assets. And sitting in a country myself that's experiencing a pretty devastating economic collapse, Lebanon, I can't imagine the even worse toll that would take on a country that's been at war for 20 years. So now the U.S. is sanctioning the country, but why do you think they withdrew, and why are they reacting like this? Is there a geostrategic reason for withdrawing now? I did hear Biden say in several of his speeches that one of the reasons is we have to focus on China. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first, I would like to say that I know you're in Beirut, in Lebanon, and I know there are rolling power cuts, electricity cuts, and so on. I'd like you to know, Rania, that after spending $2.26 trillion in Afghanistan, the United States bill is about that, 65% of Afghan people do not have an electricity connection. So this is in 2021. And I know that people in Lebanon complain, say the power gets cut, but at least you have a connection to your house. 65% of Afghans do not have a power connection. Half of Afghanistan people are in poverty. Let's just put that out there. Yes, I think they did withdraw in a humiliating way from Afghanistan because they want to refocus on China. I think that was it. And I think there was a kind of exhaustion drift regarding this war. What was really interesting was the deceit of the US political and military class. Joe Biden said, we didn't realize the Afghan army was going to collapse so fast in about 10, 11 days. He said, why didn't they fight, as if that it's their problem? Lloyd Austin, defense secretary, said, we didn't know, there was an intelligence failure and so on. I find it all very hard to believe. And you don't need to listen to me. You really don't need to listen to me because, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan was on CNN. And what Imran said is very much worth taking to heart. He said that in 2008, he visited the United States, met with Joe Biden, met with John Kerry, Vice President and Secretary of State, and he told them that you're losing the war. Right now you have about 150,000 troops. You should now, from a position of military strength, sue for peace with the Taliban. Don't wait it out. That's what he claims he told them. They have not denied what he said. Then he said in 2010, Chief of Military Staff from Pakistan went to meet Obama personally, told him, you're losing the war. The Afghan army is not going to be able to fight when you leave. You got to sue for peace. That's what Imran Khan told CNN just a few days ago. Now, that's interesting. I mean, look, the Special Inspector General of the United States on Afghanistan in every annual report said that the Afghan army is not going to be able to stand up. It's a ghost army and so on. So this was in the public domain. The SIGAR reports, the Special Inspector General report, in the public. You can download the PDFs. How is it that Lloyd Austin now can say there was an intelligence failure? What do they mean by that? I mean, they hoodwink people over and over and over again. There was no good way for them to withdraw, frankly, in the last period. Perhaps Imran Khan was right. In 2008, 150,000 troops in Afghanistan. Maybe they could have sat down with the Taliban and said, we are now demanding an agreement with you. Let's get it done with. Maybe it would have been different then. Now the Taliban is in charge. In just about a week, they swept the northern provinces. That should have come as a great humiliation to the Northern Alliance, because these are provinces with many of them majority Tajiks and others. They just welcomed the Taliban. Why? This needs to be understood and thought through. But certainly, the United States lost this war. It was a humiliating departure. The United States lost this war, and I don't see any of the sitting generals right now denying that. In fact, General Milley, who has been in the news recently regarding the warnings he had given the Chinese, telling them, look, we are not trying to attack you, that is the United States and so on. He went before the US government recently and said, look, the withdrawal was a tactical victory, meaning got all the troops out, but it was a strategic defeat. That was his terms, a strategic defeat. I think they knew that there was they were just draw this out. There was no way to actually win in Afghanistan, and they needed to focus attention on China. I mean, other people have other kinds of theories, but I think, sometimes, Rania, the most obvious answer is the correct one.
Right. It's the answer that they're actually telling us too. And sometimes they mean what they say. I mean, it really is just incredible the point you made about $2.6 trillion being spent and 65% of Afghans having no electricity. I mean, in a way, you're talking about people welcoming the Taliban. It's like, imagine what the US had to have done for 20 years to make the Taliban look good. It's a really nasty organization. So there you have it. But I guess,
Rania, just to say, this is the second time that the history has made the Taliban look good, because when they came to power in 1996, they were welcomed by some sections, large sections of Afghan society. Similar now. Now, the issue is, of course, they are a socially regressive force. It's an anti-woman force. It has serious problems with diversity of all kinds and so on, and they must be challenged. But they will be challenged from within Afghanistan. We've already seen protests. Let the Afghan people settle accounts with the Taliban. I don't think aerial bombardment is going to do the job.
No, I don't think so either. And actually, that kind of feeds into the last question I have for you, which I think, is more just like a reflection from your end here. What's the takeaway from all this? What should our position moving forward be as leftists? So, on the one hand, it's tempting to cheer an indigenous movement expelling imperialist occupiers, right? But on the other hand, when that movement is the Taliban, it's hard to find much common ground with them, as you mentioned. Obviously the Taliban's horrendous, but like you said, the U.S. military aerial bombardment are not and never were the answer. So what should our takeaway from all of this be?
Well, firstly, I would never cheer the Taliban taking Kabul. I have a different opinion. My opinion is I'm very glad the United States is gone, at least overtly gone. I don't know what covert activities they're doing, but they're gone overtly. I'm very happy for that. The Taliban is in power. That's regrettable, totally regrettable. There is nothing good about that. Nothing good will come from this government. I just reported a piece about Badakhshan province in the north, because that's where the current economy minister comes from. He's the only Tajik in the cabinet, and he's going to have his hands, it's very hard for them to put forward an economic agenda. Plus, Ayatollah Khomeini was once quoted, or maybe it was apocryphal, as saying economics is for donkeys. Not in the modern world. It's certainly not for donkeys in the modern world. You got to take it really seriously. And I just don't think the Taliban are serious people when it comes to, things like economics,
for governing,
improving the well-being of people and so on. I don't think they're serious people. They may have all kinds of social problems, the misogyny and so on. That's all true. But the other great problem they have is they're just not serious at building a modern state, it seems to me. The Turks offered to run Kabul airport for them, because, they don't have the wherewithal, the technical capacity and so on. And they immediately said, no, we'll do it. And they put, this guy who has no technical competence to be the vice chancellor of Kabul University. They just don't seem serious,
Yeah, like who's going to do air traffic control at the Taliban? Like that's actually quite serious, alarming. Yeah.
So my feeling is that right now we have to look in two directions if we actually care about Afghanistan and its people. One is, you got to trust the capacity of this long history that goes back to the founding of the journal called Sirajul Akbar in the 1920s. This great period of reform. That reform agenda, which included the communists, it's still there in Afghanistan. I remember these communists in the period when Hamid Karzai was the president. They had started NGOs and they were part of this and that, Save the Children. They were there. They're going to have to regroup. They're going to have to build their strength and so on. Afghanistan is going to have to build its own mass struggles for land reform, struggles against hunger and so on. We're going to see this happen. We've already seen bits and pieces of it. The Afghans no longer, I think, are going to benefit from somebody giving them arms to start a war. People are exhausted of war. They've been fighting a war since the 1970s. They really don't want that. So let's see if the Taliban will tolerate an opening, a political opening, where people start demonstrating and so on. That's on the one side. Secondly, I would very much like to see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded in the summer of 2001, includes 40% of the world's people in it. By the way, it's the second largest political body after the UN. It's basically seized on the problem of Afghanistan. It has India, Pakistan, Iran, the Central Asian countries, Russia, China, all of them are part of the SCO. Let them come up with a regional plan. Let them try to explain to the Taliban leadership that, listen, you're a landlocked country, you're going to access a trade and so on. You've got to really cool it on some of your extremism. Imran Khan, in the interview with CNN, made it clear already, I think, that Pakistan is not going to, welcome problems inside Pakistan in the borderland areas of Waziristan and northern Baluchistan. So that's going to be their deal. In fact, one of the most vicious groups that operated in Pakistan, the Haqqani network, is now, very, very well ensconced in the new government in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, including Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's like a UN terrorist list. So let's see what pressure can be put on these people, by the regional actors. Let's give the regional actors and the Afghan people some time.